Hey guys, what's up? My name is Jordi and welcome to my course. In this video lesson we are going to take a look at some of the camera's preferences in order to shoot video correctly. Now, before I'm going to dive deeper into the camera preferences, I first want to show you some of the basic stuff. Now, if you already know this basic stuff, then just scrub through this video a little bit further, and then I'm going to talk about picture styles, color space and all that kind of stuff. But first I want to start with explaining the three things that defines how much light comes into your camera. And those three things are your aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. So let's take a look at the keynote. Let's start with the aperture. So these here are all kinds of apertures. More about this in my lesson about lenses, by the way. And so these are normal apertures. We've got an f1.4, f2, f2.8, etc. When the opening is bigger, like for example that f1.4, more light comes into the camera, which is pretty obvious. Now when we close that aperture and we are at f11, then less light comes into the camera. But this also affects the video image, not only the light but also the video image. When the aperture is more open, when we go extremely like an f1.4, we've got a very shallow depth of field. And that gives us that cinematic look, which is great. But a lot of light comes into the camera. So when we're shooting outside with the bright sun, then we have to close that aperture. But when we do that, our depth of field gets bigger and we don't have that shallow depth of field anymore, which means we don't have that cinematic look anymore. So pay attention when turning that aperture. A solution for that is by using an ND filter in front of your camera. Then you don't have to turn your aperture all the way up or close. Now, when you do need to close your aperture for some kind of reason, I really recommend you to never cross this line here. And that means to never cross the 2.8 aperture opening. Whenever you do that, the cinematic look just disappears. 2.8 is a nice opening and you can find a lot of lenses that support that 2.8 opening. Again, I've got tons of more information about that in my lesson about lenses. For now, just keep in mind to not cross that line. Alright, then the next thing I want to talk about is the shutter speed. For example, we got 1/30th of a second, 1/50th of a second, 100th of a second, and so on. Now, what does this mean? Whenever we take a picture, there's a real mirror in front of our sensor. And that goes open, then the light strikes the sensor, and then the mirror closes again. Now, how longer this mirror is open, how more light that comes on the sensor, because the sensor is waiting longer and it's taking up more light. Now, when this doesn't take that long, we can even go to a 1/1000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second, and so on. Then the mirror claps open very fast, and that means not much light comes in. So you're probably thinking now, why should I use an ND filter in front of my lens if I can just bump up that shutter speed? Well, there's also a downside of it. Whenever we decrease the shutter speed, so that means it's a longer opening of the mirror, then we have much more motion blur. And that means whenever I wave with my hands like this, we see some kind of blurriness in the image. And that's also good. We need to have that to have smooth images. Of course, we don't need to have that too much. Now, whenever you go into video mode with your camera, you can't go below 1/30th of a second. So that is okay. I do not suggest to take that 1/30th of a second because it doesn't look natural. It's a standard rule and it's been measured, and it's scientifically a fact that 1/50th of a second, which is double of the frame rate I am capturing, which is 25 frames per second. Now that is a real life motion blur, that feels natural. Now whenever you shoot at 30 frames per second, then I suggest to take a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. When you shoot at 24 frames per second, then I suggest to choose a 1/48 of a second shutter speed. Now, of course, 1/48 or 1/50th of a second, I don't really think you're going to see any difference in there. Now, when we go up, like 100th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 400, etc., then that motion blur just goes away and the image is going to stutter a lot. We are going to get that stroboscopic effect, it doesn't go smooth, it doesn't feel natural at all. Now, when your subject stands really still and it's really bright outside and you don't have much moving in the background, then you can go to that 1/80th of a second, maximum 100th of a second to decrease the light that's coming in a little bit, but don't go over that, especially when some people are moving a lot around. Stay at that 1/50th of a second or 1/60th if you shoot at 30 frames per second. Now, this is a physical shutter that I was talking about the mirror. But we all know whenever we head to video mode onto our DSLR, we don't hear that mirror just flapping open each frame that we are shooting. So that means there's no physical shutter in our camera whenever we shoot video. No, when we shoot video, there is a digital shutter which is taking place. Now, how does this digital shutter work? Well, it just reads out the information of the shutter at 1/50th of a second or 100th of a second. It's just that simple. Now, a digital shutter does come with some artifacts, and I'm going to talk about that later in this course in my fallback lesson. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the ISO. So we've got 100 ISO, we've got 200 ISO, and we've got 400 ISO. We can even go higher, we got 800, 1600, etc. Now this is something very simple. This is a digital gain of your sensor. Now what does that mean? Well, it's very simple. Whenever there comes light into your camera, which reflects onto your sensor, and the light just isn't enough, you can increase the ISO and that will digitally gain the image brighter. Now, it does come with some downsides because when we take a look at the lowest ISO, then we don't have that much noise or grain, as they say, in the image. Now, when we do pump up that ISO, we do going to see artifacts like a digital noise in the image, like all these pixels that are moving and it just doesn't look right. So try not to pump up that ISO too much. Now, guys, I have added some numbers in between and I've created this rectangle around them because they are very important, these numbers. 100 ISO might be lower than 160 ISO, but when we are going to take a look at the noise, 160 is going to produce less noise than 100 ISO. And you're thinking right now, how is that possible? I'm cranking up the ISO. Well, 160 is a native value of the sensor. Now, this is again very technical to explain you why that is. But to say it very simple, the sensor works on native values. And the values in between are digitally much harder to produce. And that's why they produce much more noise in the image. So the best thing that you can do is use ISO values of 160, 320, 640, 1280, etc. Try to stay in that range. Now guys, an ISO of 320 does come with more noise in the image as an ISO of 160. Alright, so that is the basics for when it comes to controlling the light of the camera. So as you've just seen, every parameter has its downside when controlling it. Alright, the next thing I want to talk about is, again, very basic, are the capture modes of the camera. And I got some screenshots right here. So in your camera, you can choose the recording size. And for some cameras, you've got different kinds of resolutions. For others, you don't have that much choice. Now this here is a screenshot of the 600D, and it gives you possibilities of Full HD, so that is that 1920 at 25 frames per second. And then we can choose also at Full HD 24 frames per second. Then we have Also in HD format, but it's not full HD, it's 1280 by 720p. And that comes with 50 frames per second, so we've got that beautiful slow motion. And then finally we've got a standard definition resolution. Never use that unless you have a very good reason, of course. Now you're probably thinking, like, at my country we shoot at 30 frames per second. And now I'm looking at people from America especially. And also when it comes to slow motion, we like to shoot at 60 frames per second. The same thing goes, by the way, for people from Europe that shoot at 25 frames per second. You would also really like to have that 60 frames per second. Because whenever you do slow motion, you want to have as much frames per second as possible. And if you have the choice to shoot at 60 frames per second instead of 50 frames per second, then why not use that? Really do it. Alright, so if you want to see those values, then you have to go inside your menu to Video System. Try to look it up, and there you can choose between NTSC and PAL. PAL is the standard for Europe and Asia, and those kind of places where they shoot at 25 frames per second, and NTSC is for America, where they shoot at 30 frames per second. Whenever you have chosen that setting, then you are able to choose the 30 frames per second or that beloved 60 frames per second slow motion. All right, and then the next thing I want to talk about are the picture styles. This is something very interesting. The image from the camera can be controlled a lot by two things. First of all, we've got a detailed setting. And then we are talking about the saturation of the image, the sharpness, the contrast, etc. And then we have the picture style. And this is a way the image is being controlled, how the highlights are being handled, how the midtones, the shadows, etc., how the colors are being handled, and all that kind of stuff. Now, you are able to create your own picture styles, but that's pretty silly because you can also just download free picture styles that are amazing and that have been tested by companies like Technicolor. They don't do anything else than colors, so they know best, and they have created a very nice picture style which is called the Cine style. And what that does is increasing the dynamic range of your camera. And that is also something that we would really like to have as a cinematographer with DSLR, of course. So whenever you want to shoot someone in front of a window, you are somehow able to film that without underexposing the subject or overexposing the window behind. And that is all because of that picture style. Now, together with the detailed setting that I was talking about, we can lower the contrast even more, and that creates a very flat image. It looks very ugly, but we have a lot of space, and when it comes to post-production, we can do a lot. We can play a lot with the image. Whenever you head to your picture style menu, you can see that we can choose between some presets. We've got standard, and that is just a standard picture style. We've got portrait, landscape, neutral, faithful. We also have a monochrome picture style that is a black and white video. No, I don't see why you would ever do that, because you can better do that in post-production. But they are there at our Canon's picture styles. And then when you hit on info, and you can see down below, it says detail settings. When you click on that, you can change those values I was talking about, like the sharpness, the contrast, the saturation, and the color tone. And the settings that you currently see right here are the best. Those settings give you the most out of the image. That means sharpness all the way down. We don't want the sensor to digitally sharp our image. We can do that much better in post-production, and I'm going to show you that later in this course. Contrast all the way down. If you want to have contrast, then we'll do that in post-production. And if we don't want to have contrast, then we are happy we have set that contrast all the way down in here. Then saturation. We need some colors, okay, but not too much. Really, Canon's cameras really blow out these colors, so just bring it 2 steps down. Whenever you want more color, just increase the saturation in post-production. Again, all of that later in this course. Then the color tone is an offset to green and magenta. We are just going to leave that in the middle Unless you have trouble with your sensor, some problems occur, then you can fix that a little bit with the color tone. But I just suggest not to touch that. Alright, and then finally I was talking about that cine style, and you can install that in one of the user-defined picture styles. So we've got three places, three folders, as you can say, where you can store your own picture style in. And let me show you how we can install one of those picture styles. So I've got a video right here, and the first thing that you have to do is launch EOS Utility. EOS Utility comes with the camera, with the Canon camera. Then just turn on your camera and you will see that the application will connect to it. And you can see up there we've got an EOS 600D connected to it. Then in the menu we'll head over to Camera Settings / Remote Shooting. And that brings up this window here. And then on the right side you can see Picture Style. Whenever you click on that you can choose again one of the picture styles. And we got standard, landscape, all that kind of stuff I was showing you. We're just going to choose user-defined number 3. And then we can go to detailed setting. So again, like we were doing in the camera, we can also do that inside this application right here. So move the contrast all the way down, saturation all the way down, the sharpness all the way down. Sorry, not the saturation, all the 2 stops. All right, and then we can register our user-defined style. So click on that, and then just click on this folder right here. And on my desktop, I have already downloaded the Technicolor CineStyle picture style. Select it and just press open to load it into the camera. You see there is the CineStyle with the detailed settings, and then just press OK. And as you can see right now, the picture style has been installed. Now you can just close it, plug out your camera from the USB, and then you can check out the menu and you will see that CineStyle has been installed. Then go into live view and you can really see a very big difference. And also when it comes to post-production, you are going to have such a big playground with this picture style. Now, of course, there are many others out there. You can even buy picture styles. You can create your own picture styles, like I said before. You've got also some crappy picture styles. Try to search on the internet which fits you the best. I use CineStyle. It's also one of the better picture styles. It's definitely in the top 3 when you look at blogs and websites that writes about picture styles. So definitely check that out. All right, and then there's one last setting of the camera I would like to talk about. And that is the color space. And when you head over to the menu, you can find that setting. Now, you can choose between sRGB and Adobe RGB. Now, what's the difference between these two color spaces? sRGB is I'm not going to say very, but it is a compressed color space. That means we cannot find all the colors in there. Now, when we take a look at Adobe RGB, we do have a much wider color range, a much more richer. Now, we can always go from Adobe RGB to sRGB, because actually sRGB is something for the web. Everything that you can find on the web, like images and that kind of stuff, that is all in a sRGB color space. Adobe RGB is much richer, like I told you before. So we cannot go from sRGB over to Adobe RGB. Now, if you are going to see a difference between videos, because we are actually working with a compression, an H.264 compression, so I am going to tell you that it's not confirmed yet whether Adobe RGB is better than sRGB, or whether it's just the same, that you don't see any difference. But you know, if you are able to put that on Adobe RGB, why not? You might not see any difference, but when it comes to color correction, maybe it could help you that teeny tiny bit when you're doing that deep color correction, because Adobe RGB just has this much richer color space. Alright guys, that was it for this lesson. I want to thank you very much for watching. And in the upcoming lesson, we are going to take a look at the hardware within the DSLR camera. Now, that is going to be a very geeky lesson, But once you are watching this, you will understand that it's actually very important to understanding the camera inside out.